you make a choice whenever you speak in these business settings, or really in any setting. You can be like everyone else and stand within the crowd, or you can do something different and stand outside the crowd. Sometimes, admittedly, if you're outside the crowd, sometimes you get picked off. If you're the antelope that strays from the herd, you're
Yeah.
more likely to get eaten by the lion, but you're also more likely to get noticed. So you can just be ordinary and sort of fight on a territory that everyone else is fighting on, which is a hard fight to have, or you can stake out new ground and do something that others are not doing. And I believe that is fundamentally the best thing to do.
I'm here with Matthew Dix. Matt, thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
Well, I'm a big fan of yours. I found out about your work a few months ago, and I'm definitely sold on the power of storytelling. But I realized that some people listening may not be. When I asked some friends, what do you associate with storytelling? They said, it's something we listen to as children, or something we do for fun, or if I'm a public speaking person. So why should someone watching care about becoming a better storyteller?
That's a big question. You know, Depending on who I'm speaking to, it's not hard for me to convince people that storytelling is critical. I remind people right away that I work with companies like Google and Microsoft and the FBI. I work with all of these organizations, many, many organizations who have come to understand that when they tell better stories, when they tell great stories, they sell more products, they sell more services. In the case of the FBI, they help bad guys make better decisions on the worst day of their lives. So I often say that if a Fortune 100 company has figured out that storytelling can be transformative in terms of the work they do, we should all believe in it. But beyond that, I'll say that, if you're just a person who's looking to connect better with the world, make more friends, convince your child that you're right, go on a date and actually make a great impression, all of these things are critical in terms of storytelling, meaning when you want to make a good impression, when you want to convince someone that you're right or you're wrong, when you want someone to believe in you, storytelling is the way to do it.
How did you personally get into storytelling? Were you always what people define as natural? I know you believe that everyone can learn, but I wonder what your story into getting into this was.
It's interesting. I used to tell people that I started back in 2011 when I went to New York City to tell my
Yeah.
first story on a stage. But thinking back on my life, I remember when I was 10 years old, the movie E.T. came out.
Hmm.
And I came home from that movie frustrated because there's a scene in that movie that I thought was ridiculous, like was sort of breaking the story. And so I sat down and wrote a letter to Steven Spielberg and asked my mother
Yeah.
to mail it, telling him basically, I love all your movies, but you seem to have one or two scenes that kind of ruin the movie. Why don't you let me know what you're making, send me the film ahead of time, and I can fix it for you. So
Yeah.
even at the age of 10, I was looking at storytelling in a critical way, and as I look at my life, I mean, I was a wedding DJ for 25 years, so I was essentially standing on stages, speaking to strangers, trying to get them to do what I needed them to do. When I was at my scout camp when I was a kid, I was the one who would stand on the stage and I would tell which table to go to the lunch line next. But in between those
Wow.
lunch calls, I would be telling jokes and stories. So I suspect I've been doing it all my life. It became an official thing that I did in 2011, but I think it's something I've been engaged with for a very long time.
Mm. And there's something that resonated with me. I would define it a bit of a harsh truth. You say no one wants to hear anything you have to say unless you give them a reason to listen.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that, and how can someone fix that?
Well, I think the assumption made by so many people, if they get to stand up in the meeting, if they stand at the front of the conference table, they're standing on a stage, even if you're hanging out with your friends, I think that unless we're trying to say things that have meaning and import, whether they're entertaining or informative, most people genuinely don't want to hear anything we have to say unless what we're saying has some relevance or some entertaining value to them. And I think that what a storyteller does, what I do is whenever I'm opening my mouth, I'm looking to say something that will mean something to other people. And I'm sort of judging it carefully and I'm calculating it. I think that most people don't want to hear what we have to say unless we give them a reason to listen, especially when it comes to sort of speaking in front of an audience, whether that audience is 3 or 3,000 people.
And what makes them want to listen? You talk about characteristics of a story versus an anecdote, or God forbid, the story, like what we did in a holiday or a
Right.
romp. What makes a story a story? You talk about transformation and
Right. So, yeah, so anecdotes and romps, they're lovely. Those are sort of moments from our lives that are often humorous or surprising, and people like those. Those can be entertaining and those can hold an audience's attention. They don't have that lasting effect that a story has, though. They're sort of like candy. They're fun to eat, but they don't really provide any nutrition. A story is essentially about the way that a human being has changed over time, whether they have changed as a human being, like I was once one kind of human being, now I'm a different kind of human being, or more commonly, they've changed the way that they think, whether they think differently about the world, their children, themselves, their spouse, their boss, whether they sort of believe differently or have reconsidered. This is what all stories are, whether it's a movie or a book or a television show. All the things that you've ever consumed as a story has essentially been that. A person began in one place and ended in sort of the opposite of that place. That is what accounts for a story. And those are the stories we remember. That's the movies that you watched as a kid that you oddly still can see in your mind's eye, the books you read 20
yeah,
years ago that are still alive in your heart. Those are stories, and that's why they stay alive. Whereas an anecdote, a chart, a PowerPoint, even a speech that doesn't contain any stories, those are forgotten pretty quickly. They don't have the resonance that a story does.
yeah. And I'd love to talk about some strategies that people can use. But before we do that, is that a story you would like to tell to an audience or something you want to practice on to then
uh,
see the strategies you use?
sure. Well, I was at a Moth Story Slam, which is a storytelling competition
Yeah.
2 nights ago. I told a story for the first time and I won, so it turned out to be a good story. I could tell you that one. It's currently in my head, and I've sort
That
of,
that would be amazing.
yeah, I've never told it to anyone other than that audience of 500 people the other night in Boston. All right, let me think. Where does that story start? Okay, so, all right, I'll give it a shot.
Mhm.
I'm sitting in a metal folding chair in the basement of John F. Kennedy Elementary School in Blackstone, Massachusetts. Sitting in these little folding chairs beside me are three girls, Kim, Beth, and Patty. We're sitting beside the furnace of this basement, and it's running, and it's loud, and it's hot. It's where we have our weekly instrumental music lessons, which makes no sense to me. Why we have our instrumental music lessons as 8-year-old kids in the basement of an elementary school is beyond me, but that is what we do. I play the flute, which is sort of disastrous for me. I chose the flute about 3 months ago at the school's evening music instrumental selection night in the cafeteria. I went to the school with my mom and I had a plan. I was either going to play the drums or the trumpet in that order. So as I entered the cafeteria, I ran to the drums and I began banging on everything I could find. And when I was done with that, I went over to the trumpets and I started blowing as hard as I could. Little did I know that while I was banging and blowing, my mother was quietly purchasing me a flute, choosing it because she thought it was the quietest instrument available and therefore would be the least likely to disturb her at any point over the next year or so. And so when I ran over to my mom and I said, Mom, it's the drums. I want to be a drummer. She handed me this tiny, dainty little case, like the size of my forearm. And inside was a flute, an instrument I had never seen before and I did not know exist. And just like that, I became a flute player. That wasn't even the worst part about the musical instrument, though. It turns out that in my town, at least, where I was growing up, girls play the flute and boys do not, which means I was the only 8-year-old boy in my school playing the flute. And I was the only boy to have ever played the flute in the history of my school. That would have been fine if I was, you know, 16 years old and looking for dates, to the prom, that would have been great. But as an 8-year-old boy, the last thing you want to do is hang out with a bunch of girls in the basement of the school, which is what I'm doing. It's even worse because somehow the flute, it seems to attract the smartest of the kids or the smartest of the girls in my school because Kim, Patty, and Beth are all geniuses. Kim is my future high school president. Like these are girls who are highly accomplished, highly efficient, and they work like hell. And because I don't like the flute and because I don't want to play the flute, I don't practice. And so these girls are excelling at this instrument, and I am failing miserably. And every single week, I come to this basement and I sit across from my teacher, Mr. Arnold, and he just stares at me with disdain. Like he can't even bear the thought that he has to teach a fool like me. And it's killing me because school is the only place where adults feed me well and pay attention to me and seem to love me. Like school is my safe place. And the only unsafe place in this safe place is this basement where I take this lesson once a week from Mr. Arnold. So I've decided that I'm going to get Mr. Arnold to believe in me. I'm going to change my ways. I'm going to prove to him I take the flute seriously. So last week when I got home to practice, I flipped the book ahead, the instrumental music book ahead, about 3 pages, and I found the song "Mary Had a Little Lamb," which was an actual song. We've only been playing scales up to now, and so I decided I'm going to teach myself how to play "Mary Had a Little Lamb," and then I'm going to memorize it so that when I go to my lesson next Tuesday, I can impress Mr. Arnold and show him I care. So I memorized the song. It's not that hard. It's E D C D E E E D D D E E E E D C D E E E D D E D C. It's really not that difficult, but for a kid who doesn't really play the flute very well and doesn't understand music, it takes a hell of a lot of time to learn the song and memorize it. But I do. So I'm sitting in this folding chair next to the furnace in the basement, and we're warming up, waiting for Mr. Arnold to show up because it's 1983, and apparently children can just sit in basements next to 5,000-degree furnaces without any concern from any adult. So we're sitting there warming up, and as the girls start to warm up with their scales, I start to play Mary Had a Little Lamb. And the girls' flutes go quiet, and they start staring at me. They can't believe what I've done. They're impressed. It's the first time someone has been impressed about my prowess on the flute. So then Mr. Arnold comes down. I hear the metal door open. He's coming down the see-through metallic stairs, and eventually he's standing in front of us with his little white baton, and he taps the stand in front of him to signal that we should raise our flutes to our lips. But as I do, I hear Kim. She says what might be the most generous thing I have ever heard in my life. She says, "Mr. Arnold, Matt has something to show you." And so Mr. Arnold, he turns to me. It takes all of his effort to like deign to look in my direction, but he turns to me and he says, "Yes." And so I raise my flute to my lips and I begin to play. E D C D E E E D D D E E E E D C D E E E D D E D C. And when I stop, I put my flute back in my lap and I wait. And Mr. Arnold says, "That's great. But what about your B flat scale? Because that's what we're working on today." And I just can't believe it. He is not impressed at all with the effort that I've made. And he can't see how hard I'm trying. And so he taps the stand again so that we should raise our flutes to play our B flat scale. But as I raise my flute, I hear another sound. It is one of the most beautiful sounds I will ever hear in my life. It is the clapping of Kim. 6 or 7 tiny little claps for me. Her minuscule round of applause for a boy who just tried to do something special. And you can barely hear it in the roar of the furnace as it blazes beside us, but I hear it. It is an 8-year-old girl who is able to recognize what I am trying to do when a 38-year-old man could not. And for the rest of my life, I will remember that tiny little applause offered to me in that basement. And I will be forever grateful to that girl, Kim, for recognizing me when no one else could. Thank you.
I'm getting emotional myself. I wish I I should probably clap right now.
Mm,
That's that was very beautiful.
thank you.
Thanks for sharing that, Matt.
Yep.
I now know, having read your books, a few of the things you've done there, I think, and I would love to talk about them. And I think the most important one is how you appealed to that, that child in me of feeling that, I'm trying and I just want to get that little bit of validation and I'm not seen. And there's a small gesture, like a couple of claps, that can do a lot of things. How did you build that story? We don't need to go too deep, but what are some of the strategies that you use to make something that could have been seen by someone else as nothing or just a clap into something that effectively connects with your audience so deeply?
I think you pointed out something important, which is a lot of the stories that I tell that are most effective tend to seem like something very small. And
Hmm.
those are the most relatable stories. I originally went to New York to tell stories because my friends told me I've lived this ridiculous life.
Yeah.
I've died twice and had paramedics bring me back to life through CPR. I was arrested and tried for a crime I didn't commit. I spent time in jail. I was homeless for a period of my life. All of these crazy things that have happened to me. And originally, I thought those would be the stories that would be the most successful. But what I've discovered over time is those are really hard to relate to. Unless you have also spent time in jail or been on trial for a crime you didn't commit or been homeless, those are much more challenging stories to make relatable to an audience. But a story like that, it's so small, but I know it has so much that audiences will connect to because we all understand what it is like at some point in our lives to be unnoticed, unrecognized. We know what it's like to try like hell to get someone to look in our direction and they just won't do it. And so, for that reason, those small stories, which is really just I try to play a song for an instrumental music teacher. I do it fairly well, and he fails to recognize what I'm trying to do because
Mm.
he has his curriculum and his agenda, and
Yeah.
basically he needs me to learn the B flat scale, and I have gone and learned a song 3 pages ahead. I understand as a teacher today, I'm an elementary school teacher. I
Hmm.
totally understand where he was coming from. He was thinking, well, that's all fine and good, but what about the work that you were owed today or the work that you owe me today? As a teacher, I will also tell you, I probably would recognize what that kid was trying to do
Yeah.
and credit that child and then redirect the child to what is most important. Uh, but that's what makes little stories relatable is that other people are able to see themselves or their experiences within the story you're telling.
Mm. And you used a lot of other strategies like share your plan, like the backpack, say, I'm gonna impress, and then you surprise. What can you tell me something about the power of surprise in storytelling?
Yeah, well, it's the most delightful and extraordinary thing we can offer an audience. It's why movies like The Sixth Sense and The
Hmm.
Usual Suspects and Fight Club resound with us so well. We remember being surprised. That's why surprise parties. I just had a 50th surprise party for my wife.
Hmm.
She will remember that birthday party possibly more than any other party she's ever had because 100 people were hiding behind a curtain and shouted surprise to her. So surprise is something that when we can surprise our audiences, when we can achieve that goal in a story, audiences will often reach their emotional apex. That is the reason why people laugh and cry. It's because they're surprised about something. And it's why things are truly memorable in people's minds because they become surprising. So, for me, all I do is ask myself, where in my story was I surprised? And then I attempt to surprise my audience at that same moment,
Hmm.
right? So the moment of maximum surprise for me that day was when I heard Kim clapping. And
Yeah.
so the goal in the story is to surprise the audience by the clapping, but also almost make it feel like inevitable. The best surprise is the one that actually surprises you, but once it surprises you, it totally makes sense. It's why a movie like The Sixth Sense, that surprise is
Yeah.
so astounding because it surprises you, but then you immediately go, of course, that's exactly what was happening. I just didn't see it all along, right? So when Kim claps, I want you to be surprised, but then I want you to think, of course, a kid recognized what he was doing, right? Of course, the future president of the school, of the class, will be the one to clap for the little boy when she was 8. So that's my goal there. I identify surprises and then I attempt to reproduce those surprises for the audience.
And I also loved how you took us through all of that, the action and the place you were, the heat, and then I didn't know where that story was going until towards the very end.
Well, and that's the goal too. If you can see
Yeah.
the end of a story, you're not telling it very well because the audience can stop listening. Once they can see the end, if you're not there yet, they will stop listening.
Mhm.
So you have to make sure that there's enough left at the end of the story that the audience will want to know for them to keep listening.
So I imagine anyone listening would think, okay, this is great. It's something I can use to connect with people on a personal level, tell a personal story, but you've shown that it can be applied to business as well, right? I'd love for you to share maybe one example of how and this was applied in a place that was a bit surprising with good results. And then another thing that came to mind is what if someone says, well, that's for really for marketers or for creatives. I'm a cardiologist. I don't tell stories, you know? Like what do you
Right.
respond to that?
Sure. Well, I'll respond to the
Yeah.
second part first. You know, a cardiologist essentially is a person who has to communicate information to a patient and perhaps communicate a reputation to potential patients so that they have their office filled with people.
Yeah.
And so the best way to communicate to a patient to get them to understand something is through a story, or at least through a story-like metaphor that makes deep and important sense to an audience. And then the way to to communicate your reputation and your skill level is also if you can do it through a story. You can rely on sort of referrals. You can hope you do such a great job on everyone's heart that they're talking about you, but I would not place my business's future, which is a cardiologist as a business, on the
Mhm.
hopes that people are going to talk about you well. I think you need to sort of make sure that you're doing everything you can to convince people. A really good example of this is, I think, let's see, for the last now 22 years, I have flossed every single day without ever missing a day. And I didn't really floss 22 years ago. I flossed occasionally, sporadically. And I was in the chair at the dental hygienist, and she was flossing my teeth. And she said, you need to floss more often. I can tell you don't floss very often. And I said, I know, I know. It's just like food doesn't get caught between my teeth very often. So why should I floss? And she said to me, listen, plaque is like an army of soldiers, the stuff that gets between your teeth. She said it's an army of soldiers. And when you floss, you're not clearing out food and plaque. What you're doing is you're disorganizing it. Plaque wants to get all organized so that it can sort of burrow in and start to create problems in your teeth and gums. So when we
Mhm.
floss, what we do is we sort of take that army that's trying to get into rows and columns and get themselves all organized for an attack. When we floss, we just basically scatter that army and
Mhm.
force them to have to reorganize for another day. And if we just keep flossing, it never gets organized enough to do any damage to us. And I said to her, I've never known that before. Like, I've never understood it in that way before. And she said, that's how you should understand it. And that's when I began flossing every single day of my life for the last, I think, 22 years. Because someone told me a story that made sense to me. My previous dentists said, you should floss, it's good for your gums. You should floss, it will prevent cavities. All of those things are true. But I would go home and think, why am I flossing? I've got no food between my teeth. I'm not noticing any difference when I floss, right? This dental hygienist explained to me, you're not supposed to notice anything. You're not even getting rid of the plaque, really. You're just disorganizing it the way disorganizing an army would create a problem for a military strike, right? Tell the right story, and people will actually change their behavior, which is exactly what she did.
Yeah.
So
I think
cardiologists should be doing the same thing, right? If you want me to do something differently to live better, eat better, exercise more. Don't tell me to eat better and exercise more. Tell me a story that convinces me that these things will make a difference in my life, and then I will change my behavior.
yeah. And now I feel guilty for not flossing yesterday night.
Well, there's always today when you can. There was a day when I didn't do it, and now I do it. Here's my trick, by the way. as a bonus, unrelated to storytelling. I put the floss in the shower. 22 years ago, I took my floss, I put it in the shower. And so after I'm shampooing and after I'm done washing up, the last thing I do in the shower is I floss for about 20 to 30 seconds. And I never skip it then because I'm happy to sit under the water and floss for a
Right.
few extra seconds every day.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah,
Extra tip.
right. Yes. But it
Um,
was all from a story that made
yeah,
me
exactly.
change my ways. That's
Yeah,
what we have to do.
yeah. Fantastic. And back to the first question, apologies, I
Oh,
asked two in a row, which confuses. What's a business that was maybe unusual that didn't think they needed a story or, like where a story made a significant impact?
my favorite example is a man named John. He works at a biotech in Boston.
Hmm.
I was training 5 scientists to go off to a conference and talk about the work that their company does. And I was giving them stories or teaching them how to tell stories as part of their presentations. But John was the best of all of them. John decided he was only going to tell a story. His company, of the many things they do, one of them is they make tubes for manufacturing processes. I don't really understand it that well, but he makes tubes. His competitors make one tube that's fairly inexpensive, but when you buy that tube, you have to like retrofit it to your need. You have to cut it or twist it, whatever you have to do. It's not the right size when you get it. You have to resize it. John's company makes 18 different tubes of various sizes and types. So you get exactly what you need, but they're a lot more expensive. So you pay a little bit of money and sort of make it what you need it to be, or you spend more money and get exactly what you want. So John goes to this conference and he takes the stage and he just tells a story about grocery shopping. He tells me every Saturday morning he goes grocery shopping and he can't stand it. His family sort of can't get their grocery lists together in any easy way. His wife will just randomly text him items they need throughout the week. So he has to go through his text chain and find all the items that are required. His daughter will leave post-it notes all over the house with the things she wants, so he's got to gather the post-it notes. And his son just tells him stuff he wants. So he has to like remember what his son wants. So he puts this whole list together every morning, takes forever. When he gets to the grocery store, the part he hates the most is the first thing he does. He walks over to that big tray of apples that are in grocery stores because his family can't agree on apples either. His son likes Cosmic Crisp, this new kind of apple that, he's never heard of before. His daughter likes Yellow Delicious, an apple that nobody really likes, but apparently she does. And his wife likes all different apples. She wants a variety that she can choose from throughout the week. So he brings her a Sharpie and he has to bag up each individual set of apples and put names on the bag. It takes forever, he tells me. But then he tells his audience, he says, but that's what my company believes, and that's what I believe. He says, my family deserves to get exactly what apples they want because I love them. So I spend the time to do it. He said, my company believes the same thing. Our competitors tell you, here's a Macintosh, one apple, make it work no matter what you like, no matter what you want, what you need. We give you one apple and you have to make it work. My company believes you should have all the apples. We believe you should have all the choices that you want, just like I believe my family should get all the choices they want. That's all he does. He tells that story. And when we get back to the offices 2 weeks later, we discover that John has more sales leads than the other 4 scientists combined, even though he didn't report on any science whatsoever at the scientific conference. He just told a story about apples, really about the importance of getting what you want and the importance of having a choice and having a company that wants to make exactly what you need. The marketing director at first is not happy about it because I've sent a scientist to a scientific conference and he
Hmm.
didn't report on science. I pointed out to her that like now he will report on the science. These sales leads will generate phone calls and emails where he will be able to talk about the science behind the tubes they're making. And the thing she didn't realize is that every single time someone from that conference goes grocery shopping and they're standing in front of those apples, at
Hmm.
least for a while, they're going to think about John and the company that he works for in a really positive light. So more sales leads are actually going to come in well after the conference as people continue to think about John and his company providing exactly what they need. That's what I help companies do. I help them find stories that they can tell that resonate with people rather than just talking about tubes and their efficacy and, how wonderful they are. You tell a story that relates to someone's life in some way, but also at the same time relates to your product, your service, your company, your mission. And when you combine those two things together, that's where magic happens, I believe.
Yeah. Let me tell you, I heard that story before in one of your Storyworthy MD Academy, but every time I hear it, it's still, it retains the same power. And that's another thing I think about the power of stories. Um, Doing something like that, I found takes a bit of vulnerability, right? You go on stage, you take a risk. You're a scientist, but you talk about zigging where other zagging are, and it takes the courage to do something different. What do you say to people that may be a bit uncomfortable with vulnerability in approaching storytelling?
Well, I tell them that it's easy to speak highly of yourself. It
Mm,
takes no courage to say nice things about yourself. In fact, if you see someone who is constantly bragging about themselves, what you're really looking at is a coward. You're looking at someone who is fundamentally broken in some way inside and needs to constantly speak about how excellent they are in an
yeah.
effort to sort of, repair that damage or conceal the damage that they know exists. Vulnerability is a signal of strength. People who are willing to say the things that others are unwilling to say are the ones who are truly courageous. You make a choice whenever you speak in these business settings or really in any setting. You can be like everyone else and stand within the crowd, or you can do something different and stand outside the crowd. Sometimes, admittedly, if you're outside the crowd, sometimes you get picked off. If you're the antelope that strays from the herd, you're
Yeah.
more likely to get eaten by the lion, but you're also more likely to get noticed. So you can just be ordinary and sort of fight on a territory that everyone else is fighting on, which is a hard fight to have, or you can stake out new ground and do something that others are not doing. And I believe that is fundamentally the best thing to do. And I think if you look in the business world, if you look at advertising and marketing and sales, and even just the way companies are built, the ones that do it differently are the ones that are successful. And the ones that are choosing to do it like everybody else are the ones that fail to gain traction, fail to get noticed, and often disappear. So it seems hard to do the different thing, but if you just look around, you'll notice the successful people, those are the ones who are doing something different from everyone else.
Yeah. And if that works so well, I wonder why are most businesses so boring? I was looking for a job. I went on a business website and it said, I wrote it down for you. We build transformative solutions for the world's most ambitious companies by providing
Right.
user-focused consultancy, high-tech capabilities, and connection to diverse communities. And I'm thinking it means nothing.
Yes. It means worse than nothing. It's almost hard to comprehend what it what
Yeah.
it says, right? You need to kind of read it twice to
Yeah,
figure out
exactly.
what it means. And if you have to read something twice, you should not have written it.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah.
But
That's
that's
that.
that is a company that is leveraging, another terrible word, by the way.
Yeah.
They're leveraging business acumen and vocabulary in hopes
Yeah.
of appearing like they are reputable in the industry, right?
Hmm.
They're trying to establish their expertise by looking like everyone else, which
Hmm.
is something that people, it's why when you go to high school, you look around and if the people in the building are wearing Levi's, you go wear Levi's, right? And
Hmm.
if the cool people have a certain kind of headphone on their heads in class, you go buy those headphones. That's essentially what these companies are doing. They're looking around and thinking, this is what the cool people are doing, so I'm going to do the cool thing too, as opposed to what we know is really cool, which is those who do something different, right?
Yeah.
It's when the band or the artist or the actor or the writer steps outside of the crowd, right? It's when Picasso invents cubism and says, "I'm going to do something different that looks really weird but will be remembered forever." Right? If
Hmm.
Picasso was thinking, "I have to be like all the other successful painters and
Yeah.
stay in my lane like everybody else," we don't get cubism, right? So it's the idea that we have to find the courage to do the thing that is different and coming from us in a meaningful way. That is how we stand out.
Yeah. Or Bob Dylan deciding to go electric at some point and being
Right.
booed by the audience, right?
Yes, exactly. But,
Yeah.
it worked out fine for
Yeah.
Dylan, right?
Exactly.
Right. He got booed that night, but what I always say is like your audience or your response from the audience over a long period of time should matter to you.
Hmm.
If you're continuing to write books that no one cares about, maybe you should rethink what you're doing. But maybe not, because I mean, Herman Melville died with his books not being very successful, and today everyone reads Moby Dick. And Edgar
Yeah.
Allan Poe died penniless in the gutter because people didn't care about what he was writing. And today we care about it. No, I don't want anyone to die penniless in the gutter, but it
Mhm.
is an acknowledgement that the audience often doesn't know what the hell they're talking about. In business, admittedly, you do need the audience to care because your business will
Yeah.
fail if you're not getting attention. But it means also that like you should not worry about the moment. You should worry about the long term. When Apple's very famous 1984 commercial came out, during the
Yeah.
Super Bowl,
Yeah.
there was a lot of response that said that was weird and stupid. That made no sense. Today we recognize it as extraordinary, and it made an enormous impact on the zeitgeist. But if you had looked the next day at sort of what the critics thought of
Yeah.
the ad, a lot of the critics thought that was weird and dumb, and it's not going to do Apple anything in terms of moving the needle. We know it moved the needle because the audience eventually said, yes, we love what that was. But if we worry about the moment, then we're going to fail every time because we're going to be worried about how we look compared to everybody else.
And let's say someone is bought in and wants to bring a different approach into their business, right? But at some point, each of us will encounter some skeptics, internally in the organization. For me, it would have been, let's say, the CFO or the CEO. How do you go about convincing someone that doesn't believe in this? And I know that you personally sometimes failed because it happens to everyone. You give advice and then they don't follow it. What have you learned from those as well?
So a couple strategies that I tend to try. One is I encourage people to try these new things in lower stakes environments.
Right.
So if you're launching a new product and it's the biggest product in your company's history and your CFO says, we're not going to do it the way you want to do it because it's very different and risky, fine, don't.
Yeah.
But like 3 months later, maybe when you're rolling it out in a smaller market, in a less important environment, maybe that's the moment you give it a try and show people how it can work.
Hmm.
Another thing you can do is just test these things. I was working with a venture capital firm. They had a deck that was maybe, I can't remember the numbers exactly, but it was maybe 12 slides long. And I worked with them and told them that their 12 slide deck should probably be somewhere between 60 and 80 slides. And they thought that was crazy, right? And I said, well, let's build the 60, let's say the 60 deck slide, and then we'll use the 12 deck slide and then test it out internally with some of the people who, haven't seen it before. Pitch
Right.
the 12 and pitch the 60. And what I asked them to do is when you were done pitching, ask the people who you were pitching, how long did that presentation feel to you? So it was a 20-minute presentation, right? And so with the 12 slides, when they were done, they asked the people who watched, how long did you feel, that was? They didn't let them look at any clocks or any watches or anything, right? And so on average, a 20-minute presentation felt 22 minutes in that case. And then when they pitched the 60 deck slide and they said, how long did you think that same presentation was? It was really 20 minutes long. I think the number was 14 minutes. It felt 14 minutes long
Right.
because there was momentum, there was action, there was
Mm.
movement in that slide deck, right? They were able to flip through slides quickly and make it feel like real important things were happening. But they tested it internally. They thought I was crazy. They're like, we
Mhm.
can't go out to market with a 60 deck slide. I said, well, nobody even knows you have 60 slides, right? They don't know how many you're going to be
Yeah.
presenting. It's not like they can see the number 60, right? And so that convinced them that what I was saying was true, which is when you have 12 slides, it feels like it takes forever because we stare at a single slide for 3 minutes and it just becomes wallpaper. If you take that same slide and you break it into 5 different slides because it has 5 different components and
Mhm.
put each component on a separate slide, now we have, action, movement, momentum. We have the flexibility that if it looks like the audience doesn't care about something, we can just flip to the next
Right.
slide. Whereas if it's sitting amongst 4 other things, it's still staring us in the face. But so my hint there is to test these things out internally or maybe externally, see how it lands. John knew his Apple story was going to land because he went home and told his wife the story. And she
Mm.
was like, that's a great idea. Right. And so he got confirmation from the person he trusted the most, which was his wife, and then from me. And then he went and did it. So a little bit of testing and lower stakes environments where you don't risk as much. That's probably the best place to start.
And you have a lot of great advice about PowerPoint. I know you have strong feelings on that. But
I
one of them
do.
is that you can win with no electricity since you brought up PowerPoint. What do you mean by that?
Well, this just happened. Not without electricity, but I was in Orlando earlier this year. I was delivering a speech at a conference and there was a bunch of people speaking before me. And what I like to do is go into the room, an hour or two before I'm going to speak so I can hear the other speakers. I don't memorize anything. Everything is, very
Hmm.
planned but organic for me. And so what I always like to do is listen to the few speakers before me so that I can reference them and what they were saying in my own speech. So the audience realizes that this is really just for them, that this is a Matt Dix original. Like it's got
Yeah.
structure and planning, but I'm able to move content around and add things in. And so while I was in that room, I realized people were being PowerPointed to death. Like every single speaker had slide after slide after slide. And I thought, I want to be different, right? I want to zig while other people are zagging. I want to step outside the herd. So when I took the stage, they handed me my clicker for my slides. And I told the woman, I said, I'm not going to use my slides today. And she said, no, they're all loaded. They're ready to go. I said, I know, I just don't need them. And I think they've seen enough slides today. And so I did my 1 hour presentation without any slides, even though there were slides built in to assist me because I just wanted to point out to people that all of this is very possible without slides. If you're relying on slides to tell your story, you're not telling a story anymore. You're just a slide monkey who presses buttons and speaks about what's on the screen, right? Which I can get fifth graders to do very effectively, and I do. My fifth graders who I work with, they're very good at clicking on a slide and then speaking to what that slide says, right?
Yeah.
If you're a storyteller, a presenter, a performer, if you really are trying to sell your business or your service or your company, you should not need slides. I should be able to go to the building, cut the power on the building, and
Mhm.
still be able to perform and present and pitch. And if my competitors without electricity are incapable of doing that, then I will defeat them every time, right? I
Mhm.
was working with a company that this was really sad for me. They worked for 2 years pitching this enormous job to this very large organization. And the day of the presentation, they were switched from one room to the other. And during the switch, they couldn't get the tech right. They couldn't get their computers to sync. They
Mhm.
couldn't get the presentation to like line up properly on the screen. It was a disaster. It was technology creating a disaster, and they're probably not going to get the job as a result. 2 years of effort. And I think they're the best company for the job legitimately. And
Mhm.
it was because when they got moved to a new room, they needed their slides and their technology to work in order to deliver their story. I
Yeah.
would have seen it as a wonderful opportunity. Like, oh no, the tech doesn't work. I would have slammed my laptop and said, you know what? I don't need technology. I'm the
Hmm.
right person for this job. Whether there's technology or not, I can sell you on my expertise. I don't need pictures or
Right.
words on a screen to prove it. And that's what we have to be able to do.
I love it. It feels scary because slides are like that support,
No, they're
but
not the support
they're
though.
actually the opposite. Yeah,
Right.
they feel that way though,
They've
right?
become it, right?
Yeah,
A slide is
exactly.
nothing more than a visual aid
Hmm.
when you can't adequately describe something.
Yeah.
Or how often I use slides is it creates mental schema that allows for learning to be more
Yeah.
effective. So
Hmm.
headings that indicate what I'm talking about. So the audience can refer and go, okay, we're on number 2 of 3. He's giving me 3 reasons why I should tell stories. That was the first one, and I can still see just the word or the 2 or 3 words, and then
Hmm.
the second, and then the third. And they're coming in one at a time, not all three at the same time, right? Or I want to show you a picture that I can't adequately describe, or a chart or a
Yeah.
graph that I can't adequately describe. They're supposed to support what you're saying,
Hmm.
not they're supposed to support the words that come out of your mouth, not be supporting of you and your performance in general, right? At
Yeah.
that point, they're just a teleprompter. We've just turned slides into ad hoc teleprompters that remind us about what we're going to say. But if you're
Hmm.
if you're in a situation where you're speaking important things, you should not need an ad hoc teleprompter in order to get the job done.
Yeah. Let's talk about one thing in practice very quickly. What is one advice you give to someone that wants to get started? Either, like how to potentially run a meeting in a different way or answer how are you or what do you do in a different way, that something that people can try changing from tomorrow onwards or today.
I have an enormous list. I mean, first of all,
Maybe one.
they have to have stories to tell. So they should be
Yes.
looking for stories, right? The
Yeah.
person with the most stories tends to be the best storyteller.
Yeah.
So finding stories through a multitude of strategies that I have can be really helpful.
Yeah.
Noticing your life and starting to take, take a record of the things that
Mhm.
happen to you, that's going to be really important. Finding stories from your past, like the story I told you today,
Yeah.
that's a story from my past, right? Having those at your fingertips are going to be really important. What you
Hmm.
want to do is answer questions with stories, or if not stories, at least the imagery related to stories.
Yeah.
So if someone asks me today in my school, how are you doing? I never say fine because
Yeah.
the question, how are you doing, is the opportunity to tell a story or at least say something amusing or meaningful or
Mhm.
impactful in some way. So when someone says, how are you doing? I'm going to reflect on something that took place earlier today. Like today, I might say, my cat, when I fed my cat, he took his paw and he hit the side of the bowl, and the food flipped out of the bowl and onto my bare foot,
Mhm.
right? So that is how I began my day, I would tell them, right? Which was not great, but I love my cat, so I'm okay with that, right? That might be how I tell them how my day began, which is going to be amusing. Also reminds them I have cats, so if they're a pet owner, they'll feel a little more connected to me, right?
Yeah.
So just those little things start to really make a difference. You become a known person. Most people are like sort of moving through the world relatively unknown because they tend not to speak about themselves except in platitudes and boring conversation.
Yeah. Or how are you? Not too bad. That's
Right, exactly.
I
A
hear.
meaningless statement,
Yeah.
right? That doesn't do anything to get you to connect
Connect.
to people,
Yeah.
and that's the goal. Like to connect to people means they're going to trust you, they're going to believe in you, they're going to rely on you, they're going
Hmm.
to tell you secrets, things you don't even want to know, they'll
Yeah.
start sharing with you, which is both extraordinary and sometimes a little uncomfortable, but it's an honor that people feel like they can tell me anything.
Mm. All right, let's move on. Matt, choice. Since we don't have a lot of time, I would love to either I want to do a little bit of the work in progress in together. I can either tell you a story and you rate it like how you do on Moth Slam, or we can just work on a product so that people can see how you think about things and assign a story to a product. I would love
they
just to give a
they
bit
both
of
sound great. You pick whichever one you want. I'm certainly capable of doing both.
a, gosh, that's uncomfortable. Well, I can tell you a story because it helps me make it better and be doing something that feels quite scary. So,
Yeah, and you know what? After you tell the story, I'll tell you how we can use it in business.
it,
How about that?
yeah,
Okay.
or yeah, you can tell me how to make it to get the ending wrapped in a better
Yes.
way.
Yep.
Right, let's
Okay.
try.
Okay.
I try to use some of your tools. Let's see.
Yep. I'm gonna take some notes. So if I'm looking
Please.
down, it's because I'm taking
Yeah,
notes.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Okay. I'm sitting in a theater in London, waiting for the show to start. I'm 41 years old, and I'm looking around and I realize I may be the youngest person in the audience. Next to me, there are two old ladies I know very well. They notice my face, and I'm wondering, have I made a mistake by booking this show? A few weeks before, when I knew that my mom and my aunt were visiting me in London, I thought I wanted them to have a special experience. I wanted them to feel like they could do something new and novel they would remember and not just visit me. But it's really hard to to gift anything to them because they're quite happy, which is not a bad thing. But it's like, have you ever tried to buy something to someone that doesn't need anything? They would just go like, "Hey, okay." It's like buying a gift to the Dalai Lama, And eventually, after a few weeks of deliberation, I decided to go for a musical. This show that I booked, and it's a show Tina. I thought of this musical for a few reasons. One, they don't need to understand English to enjoy it. Secondly, it's special to London, and thirdly, it may remind them of a time where they still like to dance and listen to Tina Turner musical. Um, but now, as the show starts, I realize I don't really like musicals. I find them a bit weird. As if I started singing off the cuff now, it would be a bit strange. but I think maybe that's the price to pay to try to be a good son. So now the lights go off. There's a beam of light pointed at the head of the main actress with a blonde wig. She walks up the flight of stairs, and then the show starts with a bang. And as the music starts, the show starts with an incredible amount of energy. And I realized I couldn't have been more wrong. You know, it's engaging. I find myself energized. I find myself passionate and curious to know about the life of this artist that I didn't know too well. But something else happens. Not only I am energized, but I find myself being quite emotional in the middle of the show, and I'm thinking, am I really starting to cry at the Tina Turner show? Um, and I'm started thinking, why is that? It certainly it's a sad show. Like it talks about the abuse that this artist has gone through with Ike and the husband and very difficult life. But it's not only that, there's something else. And as I think about it, I realize that I find myself irresistibly attracted to the energy of the cast, especially the main actress depicting the show. And I find myself not only energized, but inspired by seeing someone that is living through the top of their craft, uh, honing their passion, and just being energized by the fact that they're just themselves at the best of their ability. And I started thinking, am I doing that with my work? Am I giving that energy to people that see me or people around me? And that's where I think the sadness came from, because the answer is no. And that started a realization in me. I felt inspired, sad and inspired. I wanted to start experiencing with things in a different way, and also getting in touch with people that have figured something out, are living through their true passion, and are and just show them that they've touched me in some way and try to figure out how they ended up doing what they're doing. And so that's also one of the reasons why I got in touch with the actress from the show. I got in touch with some of that staff. And that's one of the reasons why I reached out to you, trying to do something different, figure out what makes people uh, passionate and engaged by what they do. And now I can't wait to see another musical again. Thank you.
Wow, that was great. That was really well told. Well done.
Thank you. I think it's
Um,
still clunky in many places, and I didn't know how to end it. But I would love to hear your thoughts so that maybe the audience can also see how can you make a story a little bit better.
yeah. Well, let me tell you what you did well, because I think sometimes one of the best ways to improve performance is to tell people what they're doing well, because they either don't
Yep.
know they're doing it, or they don't know they need to do it more often. Um, there's lots of stakes in the beginning of your story, which are great.
Hmm.
Uh, you have a desire to make a special night for some people. You outline the reasons why it's difficult to achieve this goal. I love the line about it's like giving a gift to the Dalai Lama. That's fantastic. It made me laugh. I was in the middle of drinking and I almost choked. Um, you listed reasons in threes, and I knew that the three were coming, so you created mental schema in my mind, which was really
Yeah.
helpful to me. Uh, you had that moment of admission or vulnerability that you hate musicals. They're kind of weird, um, which set up what was going to come, which was the opposite of that, which was excellent. Um, and then you had those moments of vulnerability throughout the rest of the show, or throughout the rest of the story. But what I wrote here too is that I haven't seen the musical Tina yet, and I see a lot of musicals. Um, I'm aware of it though. I understand what it's
Mm.
about. But I think what you did really well was, had someone not seen Tina and not even known of his existence, you said enough of it that made sense to me, that I think you like explained the story enough to make your story still make
Mm.
sense, right?
Right.
Without going too much into the show. Um, I think your biggest area of opportunity is that I think you drive by some things a little too quickly and you could spend more time.
Yeah.
Some of them are funny things and some of them are the more important things. I'll focus on the more important things. So when you're sitting in your seat and the musical starts, the way that you portray the story is it starts and you're immediately energized. Whereas I
Mm,
think what
yeah,
probably happens and what we
true.
want to hear more is some mental, consideration. So it starts and I'm like, oh, this is actually maybe it's not so bad after all.
So
Like
that,
maybe
yeah,
music, right? So we want to have a slower build. You
right.
tend to immediately go to 100. And what
Yeah,
I want to see is a build to 100. The same thing happens when you begin crying, right? I want to, you said I start crying, but really what happens to us when we cry is,
yeah, I feel
oh,
emotional.
right, I'm feeling something. Like what
Yeah,
what is happening to me, right? Like
right.
is there that's a tear in my eye? Oh, I am not going to cry at a musical because I don't like
Yeah,
musicals, right? And
yeah, yeah,
yet now there's a tear. Oh no, now there's two, right? Like I want to
yeah.
see that moment play out. Both of them, I would say what you did was a drive-by, which is actually what a lot of people do, which is to say when I'm working with people, people tend to move through the more difficult, the more vulnerable, and the more emotional moments in their stories too quickly.
That's what
And they
exactly
need,
what I've done. Yeah.
yeah, and you need to sit in those moments because that's the crux of your story. That is the most important moments of your story, which
Hmm.
means your voice should get slower and softer, and you
Hmm.
should say more about those moments and allow them to develop more slowly.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
a lot. Yeah.
Um, and by doing that, we'll be more drawn into it. It like, when I finished my story, you said you felt emotional, right? It's
Hmm.
hard to feel emotional about your story because you didn't sound emotional about your story. You were reporting on it, but not really sitting, allowing yourself to sit in the emotion. The best version of every story is one where the storyteller kind of re-experiences the moment on our behalf. We get to see what that moment looked like for them because they're going to speak it as if it was happening to them right now. I didn't feel like I was hearing the story from a man who was sitting in a theater watching Tina. I felt like I was hearing the story from a man sitting in front of a microphone telling
Right.
me what happened, but not really trying to get back to that emotional place
Yeah.
while telling the
And
story.
it's that felt uh scary. That's probably
Right.
the reason, which is even one more reason to do it. Probably.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. The thing that people often don't say in a story is the thing they should be saying the most.
Yeah.
Right. And I say that to people all the time. I say, that was a really great story, but the most important part of the story you kind of flew right over.
Mhm.
And oftentimes they say, yeah, I don't want to get too much into that. And I'm like, but that is the
Yeah.
whole reason why you're telling your story.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Everything that came before should have been leading us to the moment when you began crying. The most
Yeah.
important moment in that story is I cried during a musical, and I don't even like musicals, or at least I didn't
Yeah.
like musicals before, right? And then the purpose of the story is to tell us why you cried, and it's your realization that what is happening on the stage is something I'm not doing in my own life to the degree I should, and this is a wake-up call for me,
Yeah.
right? But that's the area of biggest opportunity. You can also sort of play with things like if you want to be funnier and you want to stretch your story, when you said like I don't like musicals because they're weird, that would have been an opportunity for me. Now I love musicals, but I certainly
Mhm.
could make fun of them if I wanted to. But rather than just saying weird, which is a singular word that doesn't really
Mhm.
speak very much,
Yeah.
like what is it weird? Why is it weird for you, right? So I want to hear like I don't like musicals because like a bunch of people singing about something that
All of a
isn't
sudden.
true,
Yeah.
or I don't like dance, whatever it is that makes musicals weird for you.
Hmm.
Exploring that idea would also get me into understanding who you are. But by just saying the word weird, I still kind of don't understand where you're coming from,
Yeah.
you know?
When I
So
wrote it
looking
down,
for
I
that.
thought of saying, "What if I started singing as I'm telling you the story? You would find it weird too."
Right. Yes.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
I didn't do
Right.
it.
Like, why are people singing their ideas at me? Why can't they
Yeah.
just say them, right?
Yeah.
It's weirdly performative. Like, I don't want to be in the grocery store and have someone speaking to the cashier and saying,
Hmm.
singing, that'll be $32.37, right? We don't do
Yeah.
that in real life. Why are we doing it here? Like,
Yeah.
those would be funny things to say, and then I would understand you a little more.
Got it.
So,
Okay.
well
Thank you so
constructed,
much.
though. The structure was great.
Thank you.
The strategies were great. You said something important at the end. It actually had a business purpose, I feel. And it's the same business purpose I would have told any company, which is, oh, this is a story where you can be energizing your team to say,
Hmm.
listen, the way you get attention in this world is you deliver a passionate performance about
Hmm.
what you really care about. And
Yeah.
so whether you're making screws for, Home Depot or you're making pancakes at, IHOP, like, are we going to have the same kind of passion that those performers have at Tina? Because that is what gets people to pay attention to us. Whether the passion is on a stage at a Broadway show or the passion is when
Mm.
you walk into a store, is the customer service representative as passionate about the clothing they're selling that day as
Yeah.
they should be, right? And so that's the purpose, that's sort of the business purpose of that story, one of
Yeah.
the business purposes.
Yeah, and I can see many there. Thank you so much for doing that live and listening to to
Yeah,
me tell that
well,
story.
thank you for telling me the story.
Yeah.
That was a brave thing that you did there.
Yeah. We have about a bit less than 10 minutes for the last few questions. Uh, a bit to get to know you personally, Matt. You look to me like a very positive person, and one of the reasons why I reached out after reading the books was also to understand what's the power of the stories that we tell ourselves. And have you ever reflected on that?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
My wife will tell you I'm the most relentlessly optimistic person on the planet, and she can't
Mm-hmm.
stand it sometimes. I think we move through our lives oftentimes failing to account for what is happening and failing to remember what has happened. And a storyteller is self-centered in a very positive way, meaning we afford ourselves time to think about ourselves, to take account for what we're doing, to craft stories about the
Hmm.
experiences we've had. And as a result, when I look back on my life, I see a life filled with moments that are deeply meaningful and important and hilarious and terrible and all of those things. I think a lot of times people look back on their lives and they don't see very much. I ask someone, if I give you a half an hour, how many days from 2019 can you remember? Right. And if you're really good, you might remember 100, but most people will remember maybe 25. Right.
Hmm.
And so that means you take 365 and convert it to 25, and suddenly it feels like that year flew by and nothing really happened. It's not true. You just don't remember. You didn't sort of consider your life carefully. You didn't think about it and talk about it and craft stories for yourself, maybe, and for others. A lot of the stories I craft, I never tell anyone. Something happens to me that's not entertaining but meaningful to me, or something that's deeply private that I don't want to share
Yeah.
but is important to me. I think a lot of my optimism comes from the idea that I see my life with depth and breadth and meaning. And I think a lot of people are sort of plowing forward, but never taking a moment to look at
Yeah.
what has just happened or what has happened 50 years ago.
Interesting. And your main job, I don't know if it's a main job, but one of your core jobs is to teach to fifth graders, right?
Yes.
What is one or more things that you've learned that adults need to hear,
Oh,
learning from children?
I mean, the most important thing is that so many adults, most adults, speak to children as if they're like a different form of human being
Yeah.
and not just a human being. My students will tell you that I am direct and loving and brutal and uh, honest in a
Mhm.
way that quite often I don't hear other adults speak to children. They often have a weird voice that is different than their own voice. Kids want honesty because the world is confusing to them and
Mhm.
they have a hard time believing things because they don't understand anything. Like the world is confusing because they see something that makes no sense to them constantly. You have to understand, like even a kid like 10-year-olds that I work with, like the world is very confusing to them because they're constantly experiencing something that makes no sense to them because the world is just so new and different, even to a 10-year-old. And
Yeah.
so what they want is honesty, forthrightness. They want to laugh. They want to have fun. As a teacher, my primary goal, 100% every day, is to make sure my students have fun. Because if they have fun, they want to come to school. And if they want to come to school, they love to learn. And now my job is done. Once kids are having fun, it's easy to teach them because they're enjoying themselves. If a kid is not having fun, it's really hard to teach a kid. If they're unhappy, disappointed, bored, distraught, you might as well not even teach. There's no point in teaching those kids because you're only going to get the best of the best. The Kims and the Patties and the Beths, they
Mhm.
will learn because they care about learning and they're relentless and they're goal oriented, right? Those kids that were in that room that day. But most kids are not like that. Most kids want to have purpose and laughter and fun in their lives, and they deserve to have it. And so today, when I go teach my students, my primary job is to let them have fun. And in the midst of that fun, I will teach them, and it will be far easier to be able to do that. So
Mhm.
you don't get to be a kid for very long, so you need to treat it as like the most precious thing in the world for these kids, and you got to make sure they're having a good time.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And teachers can make such a difference. Uh, Uh, the last thing I wanted to ask you is on the other side of storytelling is listening, right? Two questions there. How can we practice better listening? And as a storyteller, what do you do when with people who get distracted? Is it all on you? You need to be better than pizza and sex, as you say, or is there some further consideration in there?
Well, to be a better listener, I say that you have to what I call strategically listen,
Yeah,
which is different than active listening, because active listening means you're looking at someone and your ear holes are open, right? Like listening is your ear holes are open. That's automatic. Everyone can listen. And then active listening means actually paying attention to what the person's saying,
yeah,
making eye contact. But strategic listening is while they're speaking, you're trying to figure out what they're really saying. Because most of communication is hidden. What people say and what they really mean are often two different things. And when the storyteller or any human being can figure out the difference between those two things, then we can really find the right thing to say to someone and express empathy. I think because I've been working with kids for 27 years, they
yeah.
never say what they really mean, right? So they might say like that kid was mean to me at recess, but what they're really saying is I don't feel good about myself, right?
Mhm,
And those are two very different things. And so when you hear what someone really means, when you listen for it and you ask yourself while they're talking, what is this person really saying or what is this person really feeling? That's how I know what story to tell them because I'm not trying to content match. I'm not trying to,
mhm.
that kid told me a story about a banana, so I'm going to tell a story about a banana. That's content matching. And that never feels good. It just feels like you're one-upping the person. But if the kid's telling a story about a banana that they, I don't know, don't want to eat because it looks rotten and scary because it has brown spots on it, right? What that kid's really saying is like, I'm nervous about food that looks different than how it's supposed to look, right? And then I'll think about, oh, when in my life was I nervous about something because it didn't look the way it was supposed to look,
Yeah.
right? That's strategic listening, which is getting underneath and finding what people really are saying. So trying to do that, which we can practice all the time, is the difference between sort of communicating in a forgetful way and being empathetic and making people feel deeply connected to you. So,
Mhm.
I would start doing that right away. I do it constantly. And I think, like I said, because I work with kids, I get to do that every day and have gotten quite good at it. And that's why people share secrets with me because I understand what they're saying to begin with.
Mhm. Well, thanks so much, Matt. I am a total stranger for you, effectively, and you picked up an email last year, and I appreciate you giving this a chance. And I'm sure some opportunities will come out of it, but it's just a testament of how much of a kind person you are. Is there
My
anything else you
pleasure.
wanna leave to the audience? Anything you're focused on, or anything I didn't ask that you wanted to add before we part ways?
No, no. I mean, if people want to find me, they can go to my website, matthewdix.com or storyworthy.com for storytelling. But I hope that they will find stories to tell and tell them a little better than they did yesterday.
That's great. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you.
Have a great day.